Thank you to the Color Guard from Camden Military Academy. Well, good afternoon, and we're glad that you found us today. It was a little chilly outside, not bad, but all the brass would have been a little bit sharp today if we played outside. So, but we're glad that you're here. The band, welcome to this fall concert for the Camden Community Concert Band. The band is under the direction of Mr. Glenn Price, and we are an all-volunteer organization. We're comprised of musicians from all walks of life who live and work right here in Kershaw County and the surrounding communities. Some of our musicians are students. We have some who are retired. We have teachers, business owners, engineers, computer technicians, and nurses, just to name a few. Some of our members are former band directors. Some played in college, and quite a few are simply former high school players that picked up their instruments after long years of disuse, cleaned them up, oiled the valves, and started trying to remember their scales and warm-up exercises. We're getting new members all the time. I'm playing with the band for this first time since the very first concert, and we have another member who's joined us this year whose name didn't make it onto the program. But she has worked hard and been here for all of the rehearsals, so we want to thank Melissa Bryant for joining our flute section. The one thing that we all share is our love of music and our desire to serve the community. And that sounds like a good opportunity for me to do a little public service announcement here too. One of our flute players, Lisa McElderry, is that right, McElderry? McElderry. I'll get it one of these days. She volunteers with an international ministry called Johnny and Friends. They collect manual wheelchairs. These chairs are totally refurbished and then taken on mission trips to underserved countries where they are individually fitted to each child or adult. Many people in countries such as the Dominican Republic or Thailand spend years or even decades without any means of mobility. You can help by calling Lisa if you have or find a manual chair to donate. If you look out in the lobby as you leave, there's some chairs out there that have been donated, and there's a sign out there. Also, there's an ad in the program today that tells you how to get in touch with Lisa if you can make that contribution, and we really appreciate it. The theme for our concert today is Music Meets History. All of the selections on today's programs have some historic significance. Some are inspired by historical events, others are compositions that are historic in their own right, and many of them have ties in one way or another to our local area. The history of nations is often marked by conflict, and many of the greatest band compositions were written for military bands, and that's reflected in today's concert as well. Since the dawn of man, hunting parties and later armies discovered very early that they needed a way to signal one another during maneuvers and conflicts. Shouting worked okay for small groups, but as armies grew and conflicts became louder, other methods were developed. Drums and horns playing specific patterns or short tunes were employed to direct soldiers. Our opening selection is based on a bugle call designed to rally everyone to their flag. To the Colors was written by John Edmondson and served as a fitting prelude to our national anthem. Thank you for standing and joining us in the singing of our national anthem. Those historic lyrics were written by Francis Scott Key. The poem was inspired by the battle for Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. It was set to the tune of a popular drinking song by John Stafford Smith and was officially adopted as our national anthem in 1931. As we move on into our music selections, there could be no better way to begin a concert here in the historic city of Camden than with a medley from The Patriot. The movie was filmed in South Carolina, and Camden features prominently in the story. If you want to learn more about Camden's role in our nation's fight for freedom, then take the time to tour historic Camden, which is where our concert was supposed to be today. We're very fortunate indeed to have this site preserved for future generations to actually be able to touch our past. The movie score was composed by John Williams and was nominated for an Academy Award. John Moss has arranged this medley for band, which will be conducted by our Associate Director, Mr. Robert Wirtz. the Star-Spangled Banner are tied to conflicts with England during the Revolution and the War of 1812. As the nation grew and strengthened, we found ourselves involved in a number of conflicts at home and abroad, culminating in the 16-week Spanish-American War in 1898. In April of 1899, John Philip Sousa premiered his latest march at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. Hands Across the Sea was, according to the title page, addressed to no particular nation, but to all of America's friends abroad. Perhaps the composition was Sousa's way of reassuring the world that although the United States might have been born in conflict, our desire was for peace and cooperation. Hands Across the Sea by John Philip Sousa. The modern concert band, or wind ensemble, evolved from military bands. Military bands date back to about the 11th century and probably developed as a result of having drummers, buglers, and high-pitched woodwinds in the army to convey signals to the troops during battles, as I mentioned earlier. The modern military band can be traced back to the British Royal Artillery Band, which was established in 1557. Early military bands played mostly popular music that was adapted for their particular instrumentation, and each band had different types of instruments in it, so it was really kind of a hodgepodge. Our next selection is significant because it is one of the first serious compositions written specifically for military band. The composer, Gustav Holst, was an accomplished trombonist, director, and teacher. He pioneered music education for women at St. Paul's Girls' School in London, where he taught from 1905 until his death in 1934. First Suite in E-flat for military band was written in 1909, but was not premiered until 1920. The reason for the delay is not clear, but most likely the reason was that it was difficult to find a publisher that would take on the project when the market for such a composition was so small. The piece is considered to be one of the cornerstone masterworks in the concert band repertoire and demonstrated to other composers that serious music could be written specifically for brass, woodwinds, and percussion. First Suite in E-flat was written in 3 movements: chaconne, intermezzo, and march. Today we'll be presenting only the first and last movements. First Suite in E-flat for military band by Gustav Holst. The next two selections on our program will be presented by our saxophone section. It will take them just a few moments to set up, but never fear, I have plenty of useless information to entertain you with while you wait. 1 year before Gustav Holst completed his historic composition for military band in England, Jack Norworth and Albert von Tilzer teamed up in New York to write the third most recognizable song in America. We've already played the Star Spangled Banner. The second is the Happy Birthday song. And coming in at number 3 is Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Everyone knows the lyrics to the chorus, but the verses have slipped into obscurity. They tell the story of Katie Casey, who was invited out to a show by her beau. Her response was, "No, but I'll tell you what you can do," which leads into the well-known chorus, "Take me out to the ball game." The song has an interesting history all its own, but it also has a link to local history. Lawrence Eugene Dobie was born on December 13th, 1923 in Camden. He attended Jackson School and then Moylan Haven Mather Academy before moving to New Jersey. He was a multi-sport athlete playing baseball, basketball, football, and lettering and track. He accepted a basketball scholarship to Long Island University, but later transferred to Virginia Union University, where he played basketball and participated in the ROTC program. He began playing professional baseball for the Newark Eagles of the Negro National League in 1942. His baseball career was interrupted, however, by World War II, where he served in the Navy until 1946. Larry returned to the Eagles after the war, but in 1947, he was signed by the Cleveland Indians, becoming the first black player in the American League, just 3 months after Jackie Robinson took the field with the Brooklyn Dodgers of the National League. We are pleased to honor Jackie Robinson and our very own Larry Dobie as we join Miss Katie Casey in our request that you take me out to the ball game. The saxophone section's second piece also honors someone with ties to Kershaw County. The song was written in 1967 by Tony Joe White, who was known as the Swamp Fox, because he pioneered a genre of music known as swamp rock, not because of any ties to the real Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, who had more to do with an earlier composition on our program, The Patriot. White recorded the song and released it on an album in 1969. But later that same year, a musician from right here in Kershaw County recorded the version that made it a hit. Benjamin Franklin P. was born in Lugoff on September 19th, 1931. Young Ben got his start in music singing in the choir at the Methodist Church, where his father was the music director. In 1948, he moved to New York, took on the stage name of Brooke Benton, and proceeded to build a successful career as a singer and songwriter. In November of 1969, Brooke recorded a more soulful R&B treatment of the song for his Brooke Benton Today album, and released it also as a single. The song topped the Billboard Soul chart, reached number 4 on the Hot 100, and made it to number 2 on the Adult Contemporary chart, and still remains a staple of the genre today. We hope you enjoy our saxophones as they share their rendition of Rainy Night in Georgia by Tony Joe White. Anyone who is familiar with the Camden area is well aware of our affection for horses and the horse racing community. Although our next selection is not directly tied to Kershaw County or the grand horses that compete each year in the Carolina and Colonial Cup races, it does relate to the well-loved and storied herds of feral horses that can be found along the southern coast. There are several barrier islands in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia that are home to herds of these feral horses. It's uncertain exactly how these horses came to be there, but many believe they may be survivors from shipwrecks dating as far back as the 1500s. Most of these habitats are protected by local or federal laws. One of these barrier islands is Shackelford Banks in North Carolina. In 1998, the horses there were going to be moved to another location. However, a grassroots effort gathered enough support to make it possible for the herd to remain. They are a part of a study by the National Park Service. The public can take a ferry to visit the island and maybe catch a glimpse of them as they roam freely among the dunes. Shackelford Banks, Tale of the Wild Mustangs, was commissioned for the Gregg Middle School Band of Summerville, South Carolina in 2003. If you close your eyes as you listen to J. Bo Cook's composition, you may be able to picture them as they gallop through the shallows of Shackelford Banks. The SS Dorchester was an aging cruise liner that once carried 314 passengers in style and comfort. But as more and more Allied ships fell prey to the German U-boats of World War II, she had been refitted to transport soldiers to the fighting. In late January of 1943, she left New York Harbor carrying 390 crew members and 524 soldiers as part of a convoy bound for Greenland. Among the 904 men on board were 4 chaplains: Methodist pastor George Fox from Vermont, Rabbi Alexander Good from Pennsylvania, Dutch Reformed minister Clark Poling from New York, and Catholic priest Father John Washington from New Jersey. These 4 men had volunteered, leaving family and congregations to serve the needs of those who were going into harm's way. Just after midnight on Wednesday, February 3rd, the Dorchester was struck by a torpedo. Many of those on board were killed instantly. The rest poured from below decks, trying to find their way to the life rafts. Many of the men were not in uniform, and many were without their life jackets. Chaos reigned, but in the midst of the confusion, the 4 chaplains took control. They directed men to the boats, located deck lockers containing life jackets, and when those ran out, they gave up their own to those who had none. All the while, speaking words of encouragement and hope to the frightened men. 25 minutes after the explosion, the Dorchester slipped beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Of the more than 900 on board, less than 300 survived. Many of those due to the words of encouragement and heroic actions of the chaplains. As the sea washed over the railing, the 4 chaplains could be seen standing, arm in arm, praying. In 1944, Pastor Fox, Rabbi Good, Reverend Poling, and Father Washington were posthumously awarded the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross. In 1961, Congress created the 4 Chaplains Medal and presented it to their surviving family members. The submarine that fired the torpedo was the U-233. It escaped, but was sunk, along with most of its crew, a year later by British destroyers. At the Immortal Chaplains Foundation's 60th anniversary ceremony, the first officer from the U-233 spoke. His words perhaps best represent the lessons of the 4 chaplains. We ought to love when others hate. We can bring faith where doubt threatens. We can awaken hope where despair exists. We can lift up a light where darkness reigns. We can bring joy where sorrow dominates. The Light Eternal by James Swearingen. States has a proud history of military service dating back to the local militias that defended the earliest settlers. We're very grateful to all those who have sacrificed to keep us safe and free. We want to take a moment to recognize our veterans during the next selection. Each branch of the military has their own song, and we invite you to stand as your song is played. For those of us who have not served and may not recognize the tunes, I'll give you the order. There have been a lot of medleys written of the service songs, but the one we're using today is the only one I've ever heard that begins with the Coast Guard anthem. Maybe that's because Dick Goodman, the arranger of this piece, was in the Coast Guard. At any rate, the order is the Coast Guard, the Space Force, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and the Army. 6 service songs, arranged by Dick Goodman. Please stand as your anthem is played. playing. Let's have all of the band members who served, please stand. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. When the United States entered World War II, there were many who left their civilian careers to do what they could for the war effort. Most trained for and served as combat soldiers, but some, like the 4 chaplains, used their skills and talents to work in support roles. One of those men was a successful trombone player and band leader. When the war began, Glenn Miller and his orchestra was arguably the most popular music act in America. In fact, their recording of Chattanooga Choo Choo was the #1 song on December 7th, 1941. During his enlistment, Major Miller reshaped military bands and expanded their activities and repertoire far beyond the usual ceremonial occasions. His influence can still be seen today. On December 15th, 1944, Major Miller was on a flight from England to France to organize a concert for the troops when his plane and all those on board disappeared. They've never been found. We conclude our look at Music Meets History with a John Murtha arrangement of Major Glenn Miller's hits entitled Glenn Miller in Concert. This piece will be conducted by Mr. Gene Camden.